Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everybody around the globe. I am Thiago Diaz. I am a researcher from the Brazilian Air Force University, and I, with my colleagues, Rihab Ben Moussa, she's a researcher from the Faculty of Law and Science Policy from Tunis, El Mana, Tunisia, and my two other colleagues, Sibsan Karpalit and Subhajit Hajra. They are researchers and students from India and from the institution Life 2 and beyond. And our work is divided in three divisions: space militarization, space weaponization, space law, and space ethics. And our work, as you are seeing, is titled Ethical Considerations of Space Militarization and Space Weaponization. So to begin, it's important to thank you all for having me here and to accept our research. And at the beginning, at the top of my slide, you can see that we divided, we are pointing space militarization and space weaponization. And it's very important to make the distinguishing, because without that distinguishing, we cannot talk about space ethics. And first of all, when we are talking about space militarization and space weaponization, space militarization is the essence of many of the activities at the outer space. Since the beginning of the space exploration. It's important to say that during the Cold War and at the beginning of the space race, the space militarization was natural, and it was part of the beginning of the policy, the U.S. policy and the Soviet Union policy, to reach the space, to reach the outer space, and we know to reach the moon. So the space militarization was natural and was a consequence of the development of the space policy. And we say space militarization, the infusion of military culture, the institutions. We know that, for example, NASA is a civilian institution at the United States, but the majority of the astronauts and the first astronauts were from the U.S. Navy and U.S. Air Force. So that's a characteristic of the space militarization. It's an exploration carried out by military from the countries that are trying to explore the outer space. And after that, we must point out that there is the space weaponization. That's a very different aspect. That space weaponization is to put weapons into the outer space. So it's important to say that, because when we are talking about space militarization, for example, we are talking about the use of military personnel at the space. And this is not very different from what happens in Antarctica. It's important to say that in the Antarctica Treaty from 1959, it was forbidden. It's written there at the Antarctica Treaty that it's forbidden to weaponize Antarctica, to put weapons in Antarctica. However, many of the activities in Antarctica are driven or are led in some point by civilian institutions, academic institutions, and with the support of the military institutions from the different countries that are in Antarctica. So it's important to make the distinguishing. And when we are talking about space, it happens the same. So in the space militarization, when we are talking about space militarization, it was important, and it is important to ratify that 75% of satellites perform military functions, but it doesn't imply automatically that the military functions are weapon functions or are kind of weaponization. And when we are talking about space weaponization, that is the transformation of non-military technology into offensive instruments, space weaponization can result in drastic fatal consequences for humanity. And that's what we must think now, that we are in the 21st century with the challenge of a new kind of exploration, private companies exploring the outer space. And this is a very important point that we must to work and to think. And why that's so important to make this distinction? Because when we are at the second part of our research, that we say we talk and we show the space law, it's important that when we talk about space law, we must previously talk about space militarization and space weaponization, showing that space militarization, it's natural, and it happens since the beginning of the space exploration, when humans reached the space. And the first military personnel, as I talked previously, were from the military institutions from US or from the Soviet Union. And it's interesting that when you are talking about the humanity's journey beyond Earth, it was initiated by with the launch of the MW 18014 during the World War II in 1944. That it was a rocket launched from Germany that became the first to cross the Kármán line. And the Kármán line is the limit that the scientists, and even there are discussions with diplomats, scientists, about where it begins, or the near orbit and the planet. So it was important to show this difference, because these differences are vital for assessing the ethical and practical consequences of military technology's reach. So, and now talking of, you can see that the top of the slide, that it's now pointing out the space law. And now talking about space law, it's important that international law and space law specifically, we have the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty was drafted and designed during the 1960s, during the space race, during the initiatives from United States, and on the other side, the Soviet Union. And in 1967, it reached the point that was drafted and signed at the United Nations, the Outer Space Treaty. And the Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty forbids the placement of weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons, but has no mention for conventional weapons, for example, anti-satellite weapons, or what now they are called ASAT weapons. And it forbids, the Outer Space Treaty in the Article 4 forbids as well the establishment of military facilities or bases on the moon and other celestial bodies. However, at that point, and there are many discussions about that in international law, the establishment of military facilities or bases were drafted as almost like a military facility or a military base to military purposes, differently from, for example, the military institution or country using such military institutions and creating a base, for example, there for civilian or academic purposes. For example, that what happens in Antarctica is an example of that. And the Outer Space Treaty has many similarities with the Antarctica Treaty. It's known that the Outer Space Treaty was somehow inspired in the Antarctica Treaty from of 1969, and the Outer Space Treaty is from the years 1967. And it's discussed that there is a only partial demilitarization of space, or somehow now we can say that only partial de-weaponization as well. There are differences, and we talked previously about the difference of militarization and weaponization, but it's interesting that the Article 4 forbids the placement of weapons of mass and nuclear weapons, but has no mention for conventional weapons, and now the anti-satellite weapons. That's the challenge that we are facing now in the 21st century. And however, the use of military personnel for scientific research or for any other peaceful purposes is not prohibited, as I mentioned earlier. And when we say about peaceful, it's important to show that the peaceful term is not it has some difference from many countries, and at the United Nations, the term peaceful is somehow controversial. Peaceful, in our research, we try to use and to defend that the use peaceful must be connected and related to the United Nations Charter from 1945 after the World War II. So it's important for us in our research to use the term peaceful as a broader term that is related to the United Nations Charter that forbids war and tries, and we know that United Nations Charter tries to avoid other wars, but we know that's a challenge that we face since the draft of the United Nations Charter in 1945 after the Second World War. And yet, there is no consensus of the use of the term weapon as well. As I talked about the term peaceful, and weapons it's another term that's not clear for many countries at the United Nations, and even in the discussions in the corpus that the Committee for the Use of the Peaceful Use of the Outer Space in the United Nations, and the Security Council of the United Nations. So ethically, should the term mean non-aggressive or non-military, or non-aggressive purpose or non-military purpose? Because the use of a satellite used to control and direct an armed drone should be considered a peaceful use or peaceful use provision of the Outer Space Treaty. And that's what we research. And that's why we have to think on ethical terms. And moreover, the Outer Space Treaty, the OST, as it's called, does not prohibit the testing, development, or deployment on Earth, or perhaps even the deployment of ground-based nuclear systems designed for use in outer space or against space object. For this reason, no objection was raised by any state to the anti-satellite system, the ASAT tests conducted by China in 2007, or United States in 2008, or Soviet or Russia in 2021. And that's the challenge now. The United Nations General Assembly, the 77th General Assembly, widely approved a resolution that's the A-Res 77. That's the 77 is the number of the General Assembly, the 77th General Assembly, and the resolution is the number 41. And there you can visit the United Nations website, and that resolution urges the nations to cease the destructive testing of direct ascent ASAT weapons. And why that? Why it's so important to pay attention on the prohibition or the testing and development of anti-satellite weapons? Because the development of anti-satellite weapons cannot pose a threat to space environment being used for warfare. Now since 2022, we have wars around the globe. For example, next to the European Union, we have now a situation, a conflict, and the use of anti-satellite weapons could become a new threat to the state of the conflict. For example, now. And the recommendations from the Global South and the Global South, it's important to say that it's not it's a geographical term, but a geopolitical term that when we are talking about developing nations, geopoliticians used to say that the Global South, or some geopoliticians say that the Global South is a broader term for the developing nations, and the developing nations and the Global South, not as a whole but as a majority, recommend, and we see in our research, and we defend in our research, that must have a global consensus-based definition of weapons, which we should include systems such as ASATs, or anti-satellite weapons, or used to control or direct an armed drone or other such systems. A second recommendation should be that a global consensus, we must work on a global consensus-based definition of peaceful, which should exclude the non-aggressive purpose and include a non-military purpose, because it would become more, it would become wider definition, and it would be a law term more appropriately for the 21st century, now that we have new agents trying to explore the space, and we know that there are private companies now, and it's important that even the private companies trying to explore space or the moon must be in somehow regulated. And the third recommendation should be a global consensus on ways to prohibit the use of anti-satellite weapons with the risk of annihilation, and for the use of anti-satellite weapons for annihilation of non-functional space assets. And a call for complete de-weaponization of outer space is what we must work on, and that's one of the great risks. And why we are discussing that? And our research points out that space ethics is our concern and must be the concern of all. The three main ethical theories, there are many ethical theories, but we, in our research, during the research, we noticed that consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics are theories that we can work in the effort to work and show why it's important to think on the ethical considerations of space militarization and space weaponization. And when we talk about these three main ethical theories, we include consequentialism. That's an ethical theory that judges whether or not something's right by what its consequences are. So the results, for example, of the use of weapons in space, when we think on the consequences of that, we face, or we are somehow facing some challenges of the use of weapons in space, and beginning almost like Ronald Reagan in 1980s thought about the space Star Wars. It was a project from the United States in the 1980s, using the term of the movie Star Wars to make some assets and to put some military assets in space. And the second theory is deontology, the ethical theory that judges whether or not something's right or wrong, and it's most related to Immanuel Kant. Kant worked with the these terms of right or wrong, so it's important for us in the research. And the virtue ethics, that focus on the role of character and virtue in moral philosophy. But why are we even discussing ethics in the context of space militarization and space weaponization? Most of all, in our research, it seems it's almost clear for us that it's because principles of consequentialism and virtual ethics and even deontology can essentially guide us to resolve conflicting interests in a peaceful or non-military purpose way. Why that? Why the concerning on ethics? And it's important to remember Harold Mackinder in 19th century, the geopolitician Harold Mackinder used to defend that whoever controls Eurasia would control the world, or the world island. It was a defense, imperialistic point of view from Harold Mackinder, the geopolitician. And now Carl Doman from the United States Air Force, he wrote in his researches about that whoever controls near Earth controls the planet. And that's the risk, for example, of the space weaponization, because it could become possible to use the space to control, putting weapons in space to control near Earth, and finally controlling the space. That's the risk, because as well, risk of escalation of conflict and its effects on global stability. And one of the results, for example, of the use of anti-satellite weapons is the space debris. We don't mention so oftenly the space debris, but it's the risk that that's on our face, the space debris. After the test of the anti-satellite weapons, it results on many space debris during the destruction of a satellite, or the satellite of the enemy, or the satellite of the user of the anti-satellite weapon, for example, in a test. And which ethical principle would be the most appropriate for the above situations? That's our discussion in our research, because, for example, the consequentialism shows and points the risk of the scam and the risk of the use of the anti-satellite weapons. In these situations, decisions should be based on humanity's long-term interests, because we must avoid the imperialistic use of weapons and use of the space, because space and near Earth space and the outer space is more. It's more to the use of the common good and the common interest of humankind, and less than the use of one nation or one country or another country, rather than humanity. And to conclude, it's important that it became clear that had to become clear, the ethical landscape of space militarization and weaponization demands global consensus on terms like weapons, the peaceful term, and ways to prohibit the use of anti-satellite weapons, the ASAT. Ethical theories, including consequentialism, virtue ethics, should guide decisions amidst risks like conflict escalation and space debris. The key takeaway is the imperative for a collaborative, nuanced approach to safeguarding humanity's long-term interests in the increasingly complex domain of outer space. So thank you all for your attention. And it's important to remind that we have just one home to save. It's our planet, it's the Earth.